World War II was a gruesome and tragic time for the world. And many unlucky victims during this war had to undergo various experiments done to them while being held captive by the Nazis and the Japanese Unit 731. These experiments were performed on their body that would result in serious injury or death. And very inhumane acts were performed without the victim's consent. One of the inspirations of human experimentation stems from the decapitation of human heads. This was a common event that took place especially in the Reign of Terror times. During this period, the French Revolution took place in the late 1700s, where anyone who was a suspected enemy of the revolution would be punished. Sometimes public execution would be performed using the guillotine. The guillotine beheading brought up the question for many scientists of how long the human head is conscious after it has been separated from the body. This could have been what inspired the Axis power nations of Germany and Japan to start human experimentation on their prisoners. The Axis power was the military coalition of Germany, Italy, and Japan, with Germany at the head. This war sparked up from the lasting effects of World War I. And as Adolf Hitler was coming to power, the Jewish segregation would start. Eventually, as the war progressed, Adolf would order mass extermination of the Jewish population in the surrounding European countries. The Axis forces would be met against the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. The Nazis performed over 30 different human experiments on prisoners at concentration camps during World War II, as well as the very infamous group called Unit 731. This was a Japanese biological and chemical warfare unit that also conducted experiments. We are going to go over these horrific experiments in detail, and the nightmare that some unlucky prisoners had to endure when being caught by their heinous captors. Can you imagine being a prisoner of war? Much less a prisoner of war unlucky enough to be a part of Nazi experiments. These experiments were mainly performed to benefit their own soldiers' health during the war. Experiments such as frostbite testing, high-altitude testing, and even sewing two infant twins together were performed. The sewing of infant twins together might strike you as odd, as you might be confused what this has to do with aiding their soldiers in war. This experimentation had a bigger picture to it, especially to the famous medical doctor and researcher Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. Auschwitz has a big reputation of being one of the deadliest concentration camps during World War II, and Joseph's contribution would place him at one of the most wanted war criminals in the world. He was one of the main camp physicians who decided which prisoners were to be selected for murder in the gas chambers. He was even one of the men who administered the gas, hence his nickname, Angel of Death. Around 1.3 million men, women, and children were sent to these camps. They were forced to do hard labor. If Mengele or any other officer felt that a prisoner is not able to physically work, they were sent to the gas chamber. Aside from his main job, he was also working on the side researching in genetics, and how inferior races genetically contribute to negative traits compared to the superior race. What does superior race mean in this case? Well, it was called Nazi racial ideology, or Nazi racism. They believe in something called the Aryan race, which is at the top of their racial hierarchy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, tall and athletic. Coming back to Mengele. He of course believed in this and did tests around this concept, one including sewing twins together, testing against one twin acting as the subject being controlled, and the other acting at the main control over the body. The main idea behind this experimentation was to research how Germans could produce more twins to be born with superior genetics. Believe it or not, he once personally killed 14 twins in one night with a chloroform injection to the heart as an immediate death, after he was done testing them. He tested giving one twin a handful of different types of diseases, and transfusing the blood to the other twin, which often killed the victims. He also tested on prisoners' eyes. Once deceased, he would take out their eyes and send them to labs. Or else he would test live subjects, where he would try to change their eye color to Aryan blue by injecting chemicals straight into their eye sockets. With the war coming close to an end in 1945, Joseph eventually fled Auschwitz once the Soviet army approached East Poland, where he was always on the run since. He actually was held prisoner by Americans, but they couldn't identify him as the same famous Joseph Mengele they suspected. So they had to release him. He actually lived on until 1979, where he lived to the age of 67. Do you think Mengele deserved to be free for that long, considering his war crimes? Auschwitz was brutal, and Dachau was no picnic either. Dachau was another concentration camp that majorly tested human experimentation. The camp was established in March 1933. Heinrich Himmler, who was the police president of Munich, said it was the first concentration camp for political prisoners, and was the first one to really set a standard for the rest of the concentration camps that would soon follow it. The camp's starting capacity could hold up to 5,000 prisoners, and their work included hard labor of expanding the camp. This was used as a training center for SS guards, which were an elite force founded by Adolf Hitler. These guards would train here and would later serve in other camps in the system. An SS guard is a political soldier serving for the Nazi Party and was headed by Heinrich Himmler. They started with only around 300 members. As they expanded, they got up to nearly 50,000 soldiers once Adolf Hitler and the Nazis had gained high political power in 1933. The SS guards would be told what to do when assisting in the experiments aside from the regular camp guarding duties. Once the year reached 1942, Dachau was beginning their research. Now the German physicians started performing experiments to aid German pilots who were later sent on bombing runs. These included high-altitude experiments, where they were put in a low-pressure chamber to simulate altitudes that could get as high as 68,000 feet. After they did this, Sigmund Rascher, who was one of the main physicians, dissected the victim's brain to do his tests as soon as they died, but sometimes they would even do it while they were still alive. They did this to test high-altitude sickness and its effect, which made tiny little air bubbles that would sit in the blood vessels in certain parts of their brain. 80 prisoners died from this, and the rest were executed. As awful as this sounds, another experiment they practiced was freezing experiments. This was brutal. They would dump the victims into vats of icy water, or else force them to sit outside without clothes in freezing temperatures for up to 5 hours. The reason they did this was to test the body's reactions, and to learn how to aid German air pilots who could potentially get shot down in enemy territory in harsh conditions, or crash in the ocean and are forced to live in the elements to see what effects happen to the body and what they could do to treat them. Once the victim's body temperature reached 79 degrees Fahrenheit, they would put the victims in hot sleeping bags, or even scalding hot baths as experiments for treatment. Some other experiments they performed included testing different drugs and battle wounds on victims, such as exposure to toxic gas to simulate war wounds that could happen to German soldiers during battle. One last experiment that occurred at Dachau was forcing prisoners to drink seawater while depriving them of any food or fresh water. These torturous experiments might sound awful, but the Nazis were not the only group in the Axis power who performed human experiments. Shaiishi and Unit 731 held a reputation of dehumanizing test experiments, and even more shocking, experiments were tested with their own civilians. Unit 731 was a biological and chemical warfare unit that led by Surgeon General Shaiishi. And one of the most shocking facts is that these were performed on the country's civilian population. They conducted experiments on nearly 3,000 prisoners who were Korean or Chinese civilians. With all the experiments they performed, they did them without providing any anesthesia or pain-numbing agents to the prisoners. They would infect the prisoners with the plague or cholera, and they would then remove their organs to begin experimentation. They would study the organs and the effects of the disease before they started decomposing. They would also amputate their limbs and surgically reattach them to different parts of the body, although no one really knows how this experimentation could contribute to anything. Similar to the Nazi physicians at Dachau, Unit 731 researchers also experimented with freezing the prisoners' body parts. They would also dunk them in icy water, and one researcher named Yoshimura Hinsato researched in more depth by testing the reanimation of frozen limbs. They would hold the limbs over an open fire, douse them in hot water, or leave them overnight and see how long it takes their bodies to thaw out. These experiments were only ones known to have occurred, and no one knows everything they did, and it remains a mystery. We may never know every single experimentation done during World War II.